make some noise for all the people who put in their hard work to make these things happen. I wasn't going to talk about this, but since we talked about it, the trip to Utah where I received the award but not the plaque, which is actually I'm quite pleased about because it's fairly heavy and I'd had to have lugged it back home. We did the award ceremony in the morning, and I had a few days before I had contacted some colleagues of mine at the Church of Latter-day Saints and said, hey, I'm going to be in Salt Lake, you know, should I come by and talk with the team? And Dana, who is my traveling companion for many of these things, also was going to be there, and she said, "You'll be there." Oh yeah, come by. Well, and so whenever I do that all the time with clients. And I usually expect we just get into a conference room and we have a little lunch and we just talk about whatever, and it's usually a very informal thing. But after we did the award ceremony, we went over to the LDS church, and they had it in the library, which is this gorgeous building that they just built, and they have all these amazing archives of the works of their members and sort of comparative religions across the world. And it was absolutely fascinating. And they decided to give us a tour of the book bindery, which was amazing. And Dana's a book collector, so she was completely thrilled. And we're up in the book bindery, and the entire staff of the book bindery looks like the cast of Cocoon. And there was one guy who looked just like Wilford Bramley, and he was basically talking about the books that they've been working on. And Dana says to him, "What's the favorite book you've ever worked on? What book do you like the most?" And he said, "What book did I like the most? I'd say it was the green one." and we're like, "The green one?" And he says, "Yeah, I don't remember what it was, but it was green on the outside, and I redid the binding." And then he turns around and says, Walt, what was the green one that I worked on?" And Walt looks up from his stuff, and he shouts back from the outside of the room, he says, "Oh, that was a Gutenberg." Oh, yeah, it was a Gutenberg. Yeah, it was a great trip. But that's not what I came to talk to you about. Actually, what I came to talk to you about is a guy named Luke Stevens. Luke Stevens is a designer in Sydney, Australia. And in 2010, he decided to do what designers often decide to do. He decided to redesign his website, his own personal website. But in order to redesign his personal website, he decided he was going to do something a little different. Instead of the normal sort of, here's all my work, please hire me stuff that most designers have on their personal website, he decided that he was going to market a book that he was writing, a book called Performance Driven Design. And the way he wanted to do this was because it was about designing based on data that you collected, he wanted to do a little study. So he was going to put together a two-design study, what's known as an A/B test. And so he came up with two different variations of the homepage for his website. The first one looked like this. It was a description of the book that he was going to write, details on the topics, details on him, and a place to enter an email address if you were interested. The second variation looked like this. It was just a statement. Are you a designer? No real details about the book, but again, an enticement to put in your email address. And he then put these up on his site, let people see them randomly, and when he was done, he compared the effectiveness of the designs. The first one, the one that described the book, had 655 people come and attend, and they, about 33 of them entered their email address. The second design, which had less details about the book, had 661 people come, basically the same number of visitors. But in that case, 77 people signed up. More than twice the first variation. So Luke wrote a blog post describing that he was surprised by the results because he expected that people who would actually get the details about the book would be the ones who were more likely to sign up. But he came to the conclusion that maybe details actually hurt a design, and in this case he got more effective results, what he referred to as a positive improvement of more than 100% from the second design. And this is a fascinating case study, because what we see here is these two different designs perform very differently, but not necessarily for the reasons that we think. Because the question at hand is the reason that more people entered their email address because they wanted the book, or is the reason that more people entered the email address because it was just more vague and they wanted to get the information about the book? And the real question here is the email address the important thing? Luke sort of assumed that collecting more email addresses was a good thing. In that regard, he was considering all email addresses to be equal. But is that really true? Is it possible that email addresses collected from the first design, where people got more information about the book, were going to be more likely to be people who bought the book than email addresses collected from the second design, where they don't really know what they're going to buy, and once they get information about it, many of them may decide not to? We don't know, because Luke never wrote the book. But what's interesting here is that he chose the number of email addresses to be the thing he measured. The thing that he decided was the goal: collect the most email addresses. And so he had decided to optimize his design for email addresses. And that's a fascinating choice, because he could have optimized it for sales, which would have gotten him a completely different outcome. And that difference, optimizing for sales versus optimizing for email addresses, is really sort of the crux of what I want to talk about here. Is how do we decide what we measure, what we optimize for, and how we talk about data? Now, Luke made some assumptions. He assumed that the email addresses were equal, that every email address was equally as valuable, when in fact that may not have been true. It may in fact be the case that some email addresses are more valuable than others. He also assumed that the reason people put in more email addresses was because, in the second design, was because the first design scared them off, was his words. That somehow or other all that information was too much, and that's why people didn't put in their information. Both of these assumptions could get him into trouble. See, when we're making a design, designs are made up of design decisions. Any given design has hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of decisions that go into it. The core of what a designer does is make decisions. Make decisions about what to do. These are decisions about what font to use and what grid to use and what text to use. And all the things that go into the design are put in terms of these decisions, these elements. But the raw material when we're doing design research, the raw material that we work with is the observation. The observation of what the user does. When we get a chance to actually see users interact, we can observe them directly. We can see them interact with the design. That's a direct observation. But oftentimes we are left with indirect observations, evidence of what the user did, but we don't see them do it. In the case of Luke, the evidence were the email addresses. He had all sorts of unique email addresses. Obviously, people must have entered them. He was able to use that as a proxy for the direct observation of actually seeing them enter them. But the only thing he really had was the quantity. He doesn't know the intent behind them. He doesn't know what those email addresses mean. In order to get to that, he has to form an inference. The inferences, in this case, were that the email addresses were equal and that more email addresses were good. But was that the right inference? Was that the proper thing? We get into this process of taking observations, turning them into inferences, and then making the decisions that we're going to make. That's the standard process of design based on research. The problem is that we can get trapped by those inferences. We can get into trouble by them. In 2004, Wells Fargo put up a new version of their website. And this particular version is interesting because of a phenomena that happened. Turns out the team that was looking at the website noticed something when they were going through the search logs. They had decided to do a deep dive into their logs from their search results to see what sort of keywords people were asking for all the time. And what they found when they did this was that the vast majority of keywords that were entered were not what they expected. They expected to find people looking for the ATM locations. They expected to find people looking for mortgage rates, how to open an account. That was the thing that they were expecting. But that was not what their top result was. Their top result was nothing. Blank. An empty string. People were doing search without saying what the search was. And they couldn't figure out why. Now, over the years, I've had the opportunity to use this as a little test. I actually put this screen in front of designers and developers, and I asked them to come up with reasons why there would be empty text in the search logs. And I get interesting answers. One group of people believe that it's a focus problem, that the search button is tied to the enter key. So what's happening is the user is coming, putting in their username and password, thinking that they're going to sign on, hitting enter, and not triggering sign on, but triggering search. Of course, the search box is empty, therefore the empty string in the search query. But not everybody thinks that. Another group thinks that the users just are new to search, that these are banking. Remember, this is 2004. These are banking customers who just don't understand that in order to do a search, you put the thing you want to search in first and then you say search. Not, I want to do a search and then you tell it what you want to search. They think it's an actual order of operations problem. And that people are pressing search because they think they're going to be able to enter it. Frankly, you know, there's a lot of rectangles on this screen, and that rectangle for the box, it's not labeled as a search query. Maybe they don't know to type something in. Another theory that's prominent is that one of the previous versions of this website that this replaced actually didn't have a search box. It just had a search button. And when you would click on it, it would give you suggested searches that were very popular. Best bets, they're called. So maybe the users have been trained to just press search and get the best bets. And a small group of people actually think it's actually a bug. That it's the logging software that is causing the problem. That in fact the user's typing in a search string, it's just not getting recorded properly. We have one observation. The log is filled with blanks. But now we have 4 inferences. And the problem with these 4 inferences is that depending on which one is the correct one, you would take a completely different course of action in terms of a design decision. If it's the focus problem, you would just fix where the key is, the default key is being pressed. If it's the modeled search problem, where people don't know to type in the search first, you would change the way the display looks. If it's the best bets thing, you would actually create a best bets page instead of giving an error message when the string is blank. And if it's the bug in the logging software, you would just fix the logging software. Those are completely different actions, requiring completely different resources, sending the teams in completely different directions. And what happens is, most of the time, is when a team encounters an observation, they take the first inference that comes and they run with it. They don't even explore that there might be other alternatives. So whatever that course of action is, whatever the design decision that happens, that's the problem. And what we see is teams locking themselves into particular directions, not testing the alternative inferences. This is probably the biggest problem we have with design data, is that we don't make this switch from observation to inference very well. We make it too quickly, and we assume that whatever the obvious thing is, it gets us into trouble. And this happens all the time.
We're not going to talk about what was really wrong?
Oh no, I'm not going to tell you what was really wrong. It's 2004, I don't even remember what was really wrong. I've collected some data here about 4 popular web applications: Snapchat, Airbnb, Uber, and Facebook. And I've put the values of that data up on the screen. I want you to guess what I'm measuring here. Now I'm going to give you a little hint. This is the company's valuation. And if you look closely, the measure that I have and the valuation are actually fairly nicely correlated. It's a good correlation. Not a strong one, but a good one. One that any good social statistics person would be happy with. Any guesses on what the measure is? Well, load times? That's a good guess. What else?
Users per day.
Users per day? That's a good guess.
How many times somebody checked their stock price?
How many times somebody checked the stock price? That's a good guess. I'm going to guess that's not at all correlated.
Average time of a session.
Average time of a session? That's a good guess. No, the actual metric that I measured here is the number of times the letter E appears on the home page. Okay? Highly correlated with valuation. So the inference you might draw, if you want your market cap to go up, put more E's on the home page. It's an ideal optimization. And if we look closely, we can see Snapchat has just 5 E's. There are 23 E's on Airbnb site. There's 29 E's on the Uber site, and a whopping 59 E's on the Facebook site. Obviously, Facebook is worth more. But this is obviously what we would call a silly measure. Now, notice I said the word measure and not the word metric, because they are actually very different things. A measure is something we can measure, something we can count. And we can count almost anything, like the number of E's on the home page. But a metric is something that we're going to track, something that's going to give us an indication that we are moving the needle, that we are potentially either improving or worsening the experience for the users. And there's a third type of data. It's called an analytic. An analytic is something that software can find. This is the average time on page analytic. It's for a particular article that I wrote back on November 11th. And I want you to notice the spike on November 17th. Suddenly people are spending way more time on November 17th. I'm sorry, December 17th, thank you. What could cause that spike?
Publication, mention of it in public.
A mention of it in a publication suddenly makes people read slower. Is that what you're saying?
Or sample size.
Sample size suddenly makes people read slower. What would make people spend more time on the page, Elliot?
Slower response time changing pages.
Could be a server problem. Could be almost anything. It could be nothing. We jumped from about an average of 8 seconds per page for a 1,700-word article to suddenly 27 seconds per page on average.
Somebody opened the page and left it open after they went to bed.
Yeah, so there's the big theory. December 17th was a day that people went to pee. Right? Because the number one thing that would cause the time on page to rise is you open it in your browser and then you go pee. Changes the ratio completely. The problem with time on page is that this is an unobserved metric. It is just an analytic. And we can sit here and come up with inferences all we want, but we can't even test them. They're not useful. And in fact, this one comes out of Google Analytics. Almost everything that comes out of Google Analytics is untestable, unuseful. The reason it's in Google Analytics is because Google can measure it. So they take anything they can measure, they put it into the software, and they give it to you for free, which is pretty much what it's worth to you. So, analytics are not necessarily good metrics because they don't tell us why the user's doing anything. We don't know how to make a design decision based on what we're seeing. That's a behavioral metric, time on page. There's another type of metric known as an attitudinal one. Attitudinal measures and attitudinal metrics. I've compiled a list of words. I want you to see if you can pick out the one that's a little different than the others. We have delightful, amazing, awesome, excellent, remarkable, incredible, and satisfactory. Which one do you think is different?
The bottom.
Yeah. Satisfactory is not the best superlative in the world. But interestingly enough, it's one of the most popular measures that we use for attitude. We call them satisfaction measures. Satisfactory is not a great endorsement. I mean, imagine movie quotes. The most satisfactory movie that George Clooney has ever made. A highly satisfactory movie that you should go see, right? I mean, nobody would use that word unless they had nothing else good to say about the movie. That would be like the best they could pull out of it. Satisfactory is sort of the computer equivalent to the food equivalent of edible. Nobody says, oh, you got to try this restaurant. It was incredibly edible. Yet what do? We put together surveys for satisfaction. Satisfaction surveys, right? And we put them on a scale that goes from extremely satisfied to extremely dissatisfied. Right? That's like saying, hey, that meal you had, Was it extremely edible, very edible, edible, hardly edible, extremely not edible? Right? It's not a meaningful phrase. It's not a meaningful term. Yet this is what organizations base design decisions on. And it gets crazier. There's an organization called ACSI, which has put together a standard index on satisfaction across all the companies. Companies buy from them a subscription, and as part of their subscription, they get all their competitors' satisfaction ratings. But part of the subscription price means that they have to put in their satisfaction ratings. And here's the crazy thing. The best airline, which is Southwest, in their index, gets an 84 on a scale of 0 to 100. The worst airline, which is my personal favorite, United, they get a 60. A 60 on a 0 to 100. They get a 60. United is an airline that has figured out how to get monks to complain. And yet, they only get a 60. That's the lowest score you can possibly get on the ACSI index, because satisfaction is an actually extremely crappy measure. It doesn't actually tell us much. Another measure that companies use is conversion rate. Conversion rate seems like a good measure. Conversion rate is the number of people who take an action divided by the number of people who have the opportunity to take the action. So usually in e-commerce, it's the number of people who buy something versus the number of visitors who came to the site. And the problem with conversion, on the surface it sounds like a great idea. You're measuring who bought versus who came. But the problem with conversion rate is that it's a ratio. Ratios do not make good metrics. The reason ratios don't make good metrics is they have a numerator and a denominator. And you can change the metric by modifying either of them. I was speaking in front of a group of e-commerce executives who were all very concerned about the conversion rate of their websites and how they could increase it. And I got up and I said, I have a secret that will take you almost no effort, cost you virtually no budget, that will dramatically increase your conversion rate over the next few weeks. And they all leaned forward. They're like, you going to tell us? I said, absolutely. Here it is. My one weird trick. Stop marketing. Stop spending any money on marketing. That will do it. And they looked at me like I was insane. And I then explained to them that there's a numerator and a denominator. The numerator are the number of people who purchase. The denominator are the number of people who visit. You can increase conversion two ways. You can either raise the number of people who purchase, or you can lower the number of people who visit. By lowering the number of people who visit, by stopping marketing, what you end up doing is you get rid of all the people who have no reason to be on your site. They only came because of some marketing campaign you put there. The people who will come to your site are your loyal customers who are going to come to the site anyways, who are already ready to purchase from you anyways. They're going to come, they're going to make a purchase. So you'll have less visitors, but a larger percentage of them will be people who purchase. Your conversion rate will go up. But your revenue may go down. They're like, no, that can't happen. I said, oh yeah, it can. It does. And I said, look, imagine I have two doors. In one door, I can give you a dramatically increased conversion rate, but actually less revenue than you're getting today. And the other door, I can get you a dramatically increased revenue, but your conversion rate will drop horribly. Which would you take? A higher conversion rate or higher revenue? And they had to think about it. And finally they said, I guess we want the money. I said, okay, why are we talking about conversion rates? Right? Money is the important metric here. Conversion rate is a measure, a ratio measure no less, that actually doesn't tell us very much at all. And so, the deal is, that often measures and metrics are used to sell products, to sell services, to get people to buy into an agenda. But they aren't actually indicative of what's happening in your design. And they don't help you. We have to be very careful about what we do for metrics and measures. Otherwise, we're just torturing data. This is the Twitter feed of an astronaut on the International Space Station named Terry Virts. And Terry is an avid photographer. So a dozen or so times a day, he will post these amazing pictures of our planet and of activities on the space station. And you can see them right in Twitter. You just go and you follow him and they just show up in the stream. So you don't have to do anything to see the pictures. Of course, you click on them, you see them bigger, you see them better, but you can just view them without taking any action whatsoever. This is my friend Mike Montero. And he uses Instagram. Instagram's pictures used to appear just like Terry Virts' pictures. But the day that Instagram was acquired by Facebook, the pictures were replaced with a link. Now you have to click on the link to see what the picture is. The interesting thing here is that this is intentional. Remember, design is the rendering of intent. And Instagram has intentionally decided that you should click. They want you to click because clicking increases their value. Right now, in Silicon Valley, the key metric that companies are using to determine whether these businesses are valuable or not is something called a MAU, an M-A-U, a monthly average user, and monthly active user. And MAUs turn out to be how they decide how much to value a company. A company that has a large number of monthly average users, but a small market value, is a very good purchase in the minds of the investors and acquirers of companies. This is why WhatsApp, which got acquired for $19 billion by Facebook, was seen as a good deal because they have so many monthly active users. That's the metric that they're using. But the interesting thing about chasing MAUs, by trying to optimize for MAUs, is that it changes the interaction. LinkedIn, for example, has a group function that allows people to put together groups and have discussions. And it used to be in the group functionality that when you had a conversation, the messages in the conversation would show up in your email, so that if you were involved in that conversation, you could participate. You could even reply in the email and send it back. But now they've changed the design. You just get the first sentence of the person's response. If you want to read the entire response, you have to go and visit the website. You have to go and visit the website because they are chasing MAUs. They want you to be an active user. And if you just interact through email, they can't measure that. They need something they can measure. So making you click is the tax for them to get something to measure. The more people who click, the more monthly active users they get. Facebook has done the same thing, where you get messages saying that someone commented to your post, but they don't tell you what post. You don't actually know what this is in reference. You get no context whatsoever. If you only have one post a week, it's probably easy to discern. But if you're one of those people who fills up your Facebook, you get people responding to it, you actually don't know what they're talking about. You have to click through. Again, it's an attempt to boost monthly active users. And this is what happens when we set business objectives and take our metrics from the business objectives. We are actually changing the behaviors of the user. The problem is, in these cases, the business objective forces a behavior that is different from what the user experience should be. They're degrading the experience because the business objective and the user experience are at odds. And when we have to pick between a user experience and a business objective, the business objective wins. We're much better off when we can design for the behaviors and achieve a good business objective. Recently, the founder of Twitter and a website called Medium, Ev Williams, wrote a piece against MAUs, primarily spawned by the fact that the press was touting that Instagram now had a larger set of MAUs every month than Twitter did. So that was a reaction to say, well, MAUs aren't that important anymore. And his site, Medium, has a different metric. They have reads. They actually measure the reads. He says that it's not how much time or how active people are on the site, whether they compose stuff, whether they write stuff. It's whether they're reading stuff that's important. So in their stats, they tell you what percentage of people actually read the article that you put on the site. Another site by a guy named Jeff Atwood called Discourse is the same way. Their key metrics are all around reads and reading, not posting. So they're looking at value from people actually participating through digesting the information. And so this is about using metrics that make sense. One of the problems with Google Analytics is that it's very hard to discriminate through your user base. They average everything together. The reason that time on page is such a low number, less than 15 seconds in most pages, is not because people can somehow absorb the page in 15 seconds. It's because most people who come to the page leave the page almost immediately. Let me rephrase that. Most visitors to the page leave the page before that, because we actually don't know if they're people. They could be some sort of robot that's just looking for keywords on the page and can do that in milliseconds. So Google can't actually discriminate completely between bots and people. And they can't tell people who had an intention to read on that page from people who somehow accidentally clicked. So you get everybody averaged together. And since the vast majority of people who come to the page don't spend much time on it, the actual time that it takes to read the page, which for an 1,800-word essay should be about 8 or 9 minutes, gets completely washed out of the data. interestingly enough, we can change this. We can start to filter. An easy way to filter, for example, would be to use an email campaign. If I only look at people who click on an email that I sent them, I now know something about them because they were cognizant enough to click on the email. I will only get a subset of the users. Oftentimes, email click rates are, at best 5 or 10%. So I'll only get 1 out of every 10 or 20 users who get the email to actually visit the page. But their behavior, the people who click on that link, that's probably more valuable to me. If someone clicks on the link and comes to the page, suddenly I can use something like conversion rate. I can actually take 2 different emails, look at the promises that are made in each email, send them to the same page, and see if the 2 different emails convert differently. Now I've got an interesting measure because I've actually filtered down to a particular subset of the audience that has an intention. Remember, design is the rendering of intent. So we have intention amongst the users. We can look at that intention. We can see how we would design for that. People who are best at this is Amazon. Amazon knows how to segment their audience when they're testing something. They go to great lengths to do this. It's really quite fascinating the way they do it. Amazon will often try a feature. They are the masters of the A/B test. They have a whole platform that does nothing but A/B testing. And what they do is when they have a new idea, they want to try it out. They want to try it with the least risky users in case something blows up, something goes wrong. So they go with non-cookied users, and they only do 5,000 of them in a day. So 5,000 people who don't have a cookie. If you have a cookie on your computer, it means that you've been a shopper before. Or, that's basically what it means, is you've shopped on their site before. If you don't have a cookie, it means you've never shopped before, or you're one of the crazy people who deletes their cookies and they don't care about them. So, these are their least risky users. So if something's going to go dramatically wrong, if somehow they're going to lose money because of the design change, this is the group. And they test it with 5,000 users a day. In order for Amazon to test something with 5,000 users, all they have to do is turn it on for 45 seconds. 45 seconds, and they get 5,000 users to test it.
Non-cookie?
Non-cookie. Okay. They do that for 3 weeks. And then they up it to 1 out of every 5 users. Again, keeping it in that low-risk group of non-cookied users. Every day, making changes until they get the numbers that they want a little better, a little better. And then they do it with 5,000 cookied users, again, turning it on for 45 seconds, turning it off, and seeing what happens. Changing it every day for 3 weeks, and then cookied users 1 out of every 5. And finally, they do this for everyone. So it actually takes them 12 weeks to get to the point that they push it to everybody before they finally decide that it's good enough to keep into the product. And that's fascinating because the metric that they use to decide if something is good enough or not is a simple metric. It's revenue. They look to see if sales increase or decrease. And it makes perfect sense because they are an e-commerce company. E-commerce companies can optimize for dollars. It's a nice, simple metric for them. So it's easy for them to look at that. If the design is going to increase dollars, they win. If it doesn't, they lose. But this is actually a difficult thing because what they've done is they've filtered the users for their behavior. And the non-cookie customers may actually behave differently than the cookie customer, which is why they separate them out. And they have to double check to make sure that they all work in the same way. E-commerce sites have some other interesting phenomena. We worked with an e-commerce site that was a $1.6 billion a year company. And they had more than 1 million users visit their site every day. 1 million users translates to about 625 folks every 54 seconds. So this is a 54-second slot, 625 people. But what's interesting about this is that these people aren't all the same. They're different. A handful of them are just unusual. Like the two orange guys here, they actually produce 40% of the revenue on the site. And the 8 yellow guys, they're responsible for 2.5% of the revenue on the site each. So for those of you who are paying attention, what does that make a blue guy worth?
That's it.
Absolutely nothing. They are worth nothing. All those blue guys here are not generating any sales. So when we're looking at our metrics, the question is, are we looking at the full set, which would drive all our averages down, because most people don't purchase? Or can we filter out the data so we're only looking at the people who purchase, or even better, the people who are responsible for the 80% of the purchases? Because if we can just study them, if we can optimize for them, if we can get each of them to spend 20% more in a given year in their purchases, we can actually raise income by about $250 million by just focusing on what is in essence 0.16% of the users who come to visit. So understanding how we divide this up turns out to be absolutely key. Turns out we have some tools that are available to us. The tools that we have let us identify groups of people and data that could be really important to our success. One of the tools that is probably the most valuable tool that user experience people have today is the journey map. The journey map is when we take some activity that users do and we break it up into milestones. In this case, booking a hotel room. And then we measure the progress through those milestones based on whether the user was frustrated or delighted. That's the scale we use. Notice not satisfied. Satisfied would be the middle. Frustrated and delighted are the two end scales. And what we can then do is see their progress. We can see that the first few steps are delightful, but then it gets a little frustrating because we can't read the information or understand what it says. And then subsequent steps are delightful, but then we get into the payment stuff, and there's something about the way it does credit cards and that little security code, and it keeps losing that information, and you have to keep re-entering stuff and getting error messages that makes it frustrating, and then finally you're done. And this is useful. Now, the way we get this information is through observation. We actually sit and we watch people book hotel rooms. And we can sit next to them and we can ask them to tell us how frustrated or delighted they are. There are lots of ways to do this. You can do it first by saying, "How are you feeling?" Another technique that I like to use is to have a little scale on the table that has a frown face on one side and a happy face on the other, and let them move a post-it note from one side of the scale to the other as their emotion changes, and we just keep asking them to update that scale, and we get an up-to-date thing. But you can often observe frustration, and you can often observe delight. They are very visible behaviors in people. So we have a way of collecting this information. But then the question we have is, how many people are running into the same problems. So let's say we get a lot of issues with error messages that come up when we're trying to pay. Well, now we can turn to our quants and we can actually see if, in fact, those error messages are appearing for other people. And by proxy, we can determine the frequency of frustration if we assume that the presence of error messages when you're trying to pay is a frustrating fact. And based on the data we have from our qualitative studies, we can actually make that assumption with real success. An instance where we actually saw huge returns from this was that we made a journey map for the checkout process of a very large e-commerce site. The one that I had mentioned earlier, the one that was $1.2 billion a year. And before we started, we asked them to draw the journey map that they thought we were going to see. And they put 6 milestones down from the point that the person had the checkout, the items in their cart, to the point that they finished paying. And they saw that they predicted that it was very exciting at that point, but again went down all the way. When we actually observed people, one of the things we learned was that they were missing some steps. The reason they were missing them was that they had gotten their data from their analytics. Their analytics told them that people who go from the cart to the screen where you put in the shipping information, people were starting to drop off a little. And then when they went from shipping to billing, they dropped off a little more. When they went from billing to payment, they dropped off a little more. And they kept dropping off. So that's how they came up with their prediction. But what we found out was that in our study, there was actually 2 screens that users were encountering between the cart and the shipping information. The first one was a login screen. They had to log into their account. And what we found was that many users who only shop from this site once a year bought from them in a way that they could not remember their password or their username. Their username was their email address. Since the average person changes email addresses every 3 years, or gets a new one every 3 years, they couldn't remember which email address they'd signed up under. So they would do the forget password thing. And that was the second screen that they weren't logged in, was the forget password screen, which would send an email to an email address if you had an account for that email address that had the right a reset password, which then brought them back to the shopping cycle. So it turns out that they had not even instrumented those 2 pages, because those 2 pages were run by security software that were not part of the standard suite, so they did not instrument them. So the analytics they were using didn't even report them. So we instrumented them, and we discovered that most of the people who were trying to buy something weren't even getting to the shipping screen. So what they thought the number of people checking out was way less. And most of them were not getting through the password reset. 75% were not getting through the password reset. When we added up the average price of the shopping carts and multiplied it by the number of people who were not getting through the password reset, the number came to $300 million of revenue. They added the ability to purchase without logging in, and they saw an increase in $300 million that year. The metrics that we have need to be tailored to the needs that we have. E-commerce is easy because we can use sales data, but there are other things that we can use too. One of my favorite is a metric called the CE11, Customer Engagement 11. It was put together by the folks at Gallup, and it's described in this article that you can find by searching Gallup CE11, called The Constant Customer. And it looks at 11 different factors. And it's a simple little set of questions that you can ask people. They're basically yes-no questions. You can ask folks in a study. And it's so simple, we're going to do it right now. If you have one, take out a smartphone. And what I want you to do is to flip to some page that has apps. Some page on your phone that has a bunch of apps. Doesn't matter which one. And I want you to count the number of apps on that page for which this statement is true. Overall, I'm satisfied with this app. We're going to start with satisfaction. So just the ones on that page, just count them up. If you have more than 15 apps, then just stop at like 15. That's all that matters. Okay? Now what I'd like you to do is figure out how many are left after you find out which ones have this one true. I am likely to use this app again. And after this is true, I am likely to recommend this app to a friend. These are what Gallup call the loyalty measures. And from their perspective, this is the base entry. This is the most minimal that you need to be an engaged customer. You have to at least be loyal to the product or service. So now that you have the number of apps on that page that meet all these three criteria, let's go to the next level, which they call confidence. And there's two questions. One is, this app's company is a source I can trust. And the other one is, this app's company always delivers what they promise. How many of those apps apply to those two questions, those two statements? We can go to the next level, which they call integrity. This app's company always treats me fairly. If a problem arises, I can count on this app's company to reach a fair resolution. How many apps are left now?
So how do you apply this little theory when half the apps are written by someone else other than the people, the company, they're companies?
We're just playing with apps right now. You would do this with your own company, so it would work there. Then we can do this for pride, the next level. I am proud to be a customer of this app's company. This is a weird statement, right? I'm proud. When are you proud to be a customer of a company? Well, there are people who are proud to be customers of companies. For example, customers of Harley-Davidson. It's not unusual for them to be so proud that they actually will get a tattoo of the Harley-Davidson logo and put it on their body permanently. This is branding in the basic sense of the word. Right? So that's pride. This app's company always treats me with respect. And then finally, passion. The apps company is perfect for people like me. I can't imagine a world without this apps company. Now, these are weird statements, right? But the reason they seem so weird is that so few things in life get this way. But I'm going to bet that there's probably some restaurant that you love, that if you found out they were closing tomorrow, you would actually mourn the loss of that restaurant. That's an organization that meets that bottom criteria. There are a lot of Apple customers who would mourn the loss of Apple if it were to close tomorrow. Similarly, there are Microsoft customers, though not as many. These are the 11 questions. Now, how many people had more than 2 apps that qualified all 11 questions? Okay, 1. That's it, right? Here's the kicker. If we took away app and we put in your product and your service and your company, how many of your customers would give an agreement on all 11 of those factors? And the neat thing about the CE11 is that It's diagnostic. We can actually watch people, give them this test, give it to them several times, and see changes and figure out what caused the numbers to change. In a study we did on e-commerce sites, we looked at 5 different electronic sites. And we measured the CE11 on those 5 sites. Now the way we measure it is we give them a 3-point scale. -1 for I disagree with the statement, +1 for I agree with the statement, 0 for I don't have an opinion. And we add up the total of the questions. So there are 11 questions. So it's, bottom of the scale would be -11, top of the scale would be +11. So for example, we would ask the customers of Amazon, who are testing Amazon on us, before they bought anything, they tried to buy anything from Amazon in our study, what their rating was. And they would give it a 6.2. But when they were done shopping, it had dropped to a 5.5. And we could tie it to the frustrating things we saw in the experience. Similarly, Best Buy started at 4.5 and dropped down to 4.3. Dell started at 3.0 and dropped down to 1.4. HP started at 1.4 and dropped to -1.
How do you get mine?
And Walmart started at a low of 0.5, mostly because people just don't like Walmart. And were pleasantly surprised with their website. It raised it to a 1.1. So we could actually see the difference. This is a metric that's tied to engagement, which is a measure that is actually measuring the behavior and can tell us whether someone is going to be a loyal customer. Netflix has been doing similar things. Netflix does these really cool multivariate tests. Now, Luke Stevens did a multivariate test with 2 variations. Netflix does them with 5 different things at once. 5, a control, and 4 treatments. So they test the existing site against 4 different designs. And because of the number of customers they have, they can test multiple things at once. So at any given time, they're doing 10 different tests, each with 5 variations. Now, they do an interesting little project. Before they ship the variations, in order to do usability testing and QA on those variations, they ask their internal staff to play with each one. But to keep them motivated as they play with each variation, at the end of the QA testing sequence, they're asked to choose one variant from each of the 10 groups that they think customers will be most likely to like and be most likely to use and will perform the best. So they have 5 options, they make 10 choices. And here's what happens. If you get all 10 right, you will win a $1,000 Amazon gift card. If you get 9 right, you'll win a $500 card. If you get 8 right, you'll win a $250 card. If you get 7 right, you'll win a $100 card. If you get 6 right, you win a $50 card. If you get 5 right, you win a $25 gift card. They've been doing this now for almost a decade. And they've never given out a $1,000 card. No one has gotten all 10 right. They've never given out a $500 card or a $250 card. They've given out a couple of $100 cards, but the most of the cards they give out are $25. 5 out of 10 right, which is basically guesswork. Right? The employees cannot predict what's going to be there. The team that pays most attention, of course, is the design team. And the design team, which spends time studying users, has no better record than anybody else. But what they do is they put those variants out into the world and they see which ones win. And then, whichever ones win and whichever ones lose, they then conduct in-person usability tests with participants and watch them use each variant, trying to understand why the winners won and the other ones didn't. And from that they learn why the design works. And then they come back and they try it again. By mixing quantitative studies and qualitative studies, we can learn a tremendous amount. The new buzzword is KPI. KPI actually stands for Key Performance Indicator. Unfortunately, most people don't use it that way. They confuse it with a key metric. A key metric is just a metric that we're paying attention to that we think is important to the business. That's not what a KPI is. A KPI is an indicator. It predicts the future. It tells us something about the future. The first experience I had with KPIs was with the team at Netflix. They were taking measures from surveys. They were asking people who were new subscribers how they learned about it. And they found that 83% of new subscribers said that they decided to sign up because a friend or family member would not shut up about the service. And 94% of existing subscribers said that they were mentioning the service to a friend or family member on a frequent basis. What was interesting about those two metrics was when they changed, sales would change 6 weeks later. When they went up, sales would go up. When they went down, sales would go down. So by measuring those, they had a 6-week window to figure out what was going on. It was an indicator of the future. They invested a lot in indicators in the future, and they did an analysis. Back in the days when they were shipping discs, the way Netflix makes money is you keep your subscription. You cancel your subscription, they stop making money from you. You keep your subscription, they keep making money from you. So they wanted to know what was causing people to subscribe or not subscribe. And so they had a theory that what was causing them to stop their subscription was that people felt like they weren't watching the discs. They were sitting at home and they weren't ever watching them. And so they started to see if the amount of time people kept a disc before they returned it was an indicator for subscription cancellations, and it wasn't. So maybe they thought, okay, turns out it's something else. And they went and they collected all the data they could find, all the measures, and they put them into a large regression analysis, and they tried to figure out which ones predicted cancellations. And the top measure, the top metric, was queue manipulation. Queue manipulation is when someone goes in and adds something to their queue or changes the order, says, oh, I don't want this to be my next disc, I want this other thing to be my next disc. People who did that all the time were less likely to cancel their subscriptions than people who didn't do it. But more importantly, someone who used to do it and stops is probably going to cancel soon. It was a predictor. So that became a KPI. And they were able to design for queue manipulation. If they can get people to manipulate the queue through the design, they could actually keep people as subscribers. And that turned out to be their KPI of choice for the design team. The thing is that queue manipulation only works for Netflix. It doesn't work for anybody else. If you or your organization truly wants KPIs, they want predictors that are going to tell, you too have to collect measures and do a regression analysis. Figure out what's going on. And this is the value of data mining. So this is what I came to talk to you about today. Metrics are incredibly useful in the design process. They are not something that should be run by a separate team. They are something that we need to be working with. We need to be talking about. We need to understand the difference between useful metrics and useless measures. We need to understand the problems of unfiltered data and hone in on that most valuable data. We need to ensure that we're testing and measuring and thinking about our inferences and not just jumping to the first thing. We want to be constantly integrating qualitative and quantitative metrics. And finally, we want to work towards developing KPIs that actually predict the future of what's going to happen and how our business works. And that's what I came to talk to you about. If for some reason you found this the least bit interesting, we've got articles and other things on UIE.com that talk about this. Also, if you work in the design space and we're not connected on LinkedIn, please, by all means, connect up to me. Use my email address. Connect up to me on LinkedIn. I'd love to find out more about you. It's a great way to do that. And if you want, you can follow me on the Twitters at @JMSpool, where I tweet about design, design strategy, design measurement, and the amazing customer service techniques of the airline industry. I want to mention that, because I did before, is that we too are hiring. We have an opening for a front-end developer. If you've been to UIE.com, you will notice that it is really got a nice retro look from 2003. We would like to update that. The problem is that our software has been working too well. It's never broken. And Josh Porter wrote it years ago. And had he written crappy code, we'd have replaced it. But because it keeps working, we haven't. But we need a front-end developer to help bring us into this century. So if you are a front-end web person and you would love to work for a company that should have a website that is representative of the work that they do, I would very much like you to entice you to join our team up in North Andover. And I have announcements for it here, and I put some on the back table. There might still be some there. We have some time for questions, so let's take some questions. Did we lose the mic?
Oh, the lights.
Oh, the lights. Yeah, we can bring up the lights. And we did lose the mic. Hey, Todd, your theory about the battery dying?
Yeah.
That's okay. I can go without the mic.
All right, I think we have a backup.
There's a handheld.
Rachel, can you give your handheld to Jim?
Oh, yeah.
There's one over here.
All right, so if you'd like to ask a question, we have a few people with mics. The room is big, so please wait for the mic. Raise your hand, and
Yeah.
Jared will call on you, perhaps.
Yes, yes. Any questions about it? Any questions about it? Yes, sir. The red sweater right back here. Okay.
Use the mic so it gets.
I'm coming over.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there should be a switch on it.
How much are journey maps contaminated by the initial experience of the first few steps? In other words, if the user is deliriously happy with the first couple of steps, does that tend to raise the scores on even the more difficult sections, or vice versa? If they're really insanely, pissed off about how badly the first few steps work, does that tend to prejudice them against the results in the later steps?
So journey maps are a relative scale. They're not an absolute scale, so there's no quantitative metric. It's really just, are they more delighted than frustrated? Are they more frustrated than delighted? And can you notice? Can the observer notice a difference? And there is definitely some observer bias, and there's some activity bias that happens from the tasks, but they're usually not that relevant to what's going on, because what you really want to focus on is why something is frustrating. It's not so much that, a journey map that you record when you're not observing is actually not that useful, right? Because you have no sense as to what's causing the metric to change. But when you're observing, people are rating, that particular step because of something that happened, and they can give you a rationale. And yeah, absolutely, happy people tend to remain happy, except when things go dramatically wrong, and then they get really angry. And so you can start to see those dips and elements. And so there is probably a little bias, but it's not very important to the value of the result. Okay, yes, you have to.
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah, I actually have a question, Jared. You were mentioning earlier that they could measure stuff based on reads, and I was just wondering, how would a site go about knowing whether or not someone read the article that was on hand?
So I think they look at the speed of scrolling. So they're looking at the speed of scrolling and whether the person reaches something close to the bottom. And by looking at the velocity through the page, if it's sort of a constant pace and they get to the bottom, they consider that a read versus a skim. And so it's a proxy measure. It's not an act. They're not actually observing it, but it probably comes. It's much closer than anything else, and it feels more valuable at this point. It'll be a while before we know whether this is really a useful measure, but it's definitely nice to see sites looking at reads instead of looking at just page views. Because reads, for example, would tell a site like the New York Times whether the investment in long-form journalism was worth it versus shorter articles. And that's an important design decision because long-form journalism is very expensive to produce. And knowing whether it is valuable is key. Knowing whether it's valuable to a certain segment of the audience is key. So being able to slice and filter the data based and look at who's paying for long form is really a sort of key metric. Yes, sir.
A somewhat peculiar question, not necessarily directed.
I'll be the judge of that.
So, folks who know me know that I'm frequently giving feedback to vendors and sites. And there have been a lot of sites that move a lot of money around that I've worked with where at the end I say, you guys need to talk to Jared Spool. Your user interface is terrible.
Well, thank you.
Do you have
Is that a metric I track as to how many people you send me?
if you actually had some sort of launch pad or something where, like a hall of shame that vendors look at to know that really no, they do need to go talk to you, that we can start sort of nudging these folks towards, or how do us poor users actually start the process of getting these people the kinds of clue that you've been sharing with us tonight?
I think the best way to do it is to hit them in their wallets and stop buying from them.
Indeed.
I appreciate the referrals, though.
Actually, they apparently haven't listened.
Yeah. In my experience, organizations that are successful despite of themselves continue to be successful in spite of themselves. They will make revenue. Yeah, we can quickly go to my favorite airline, United, who consistently for the last few quarters has had middling to average returns on their investment, but doesn't seem to be influenced by the vast number of people who are complaining. It's gotten so bad that people now CC me when they have a complaint to United because they think somehow or other I'm logging this in my multi-year journey to live tweet every negative experience I have with the airline. But the fact is that United can continue to deliver crappy service for a long time because of the way regulations and prevent competition from actually improving overall. And there is no competitor coming into the scene that has the routes and number of flights that can compete against United. So United, the only airline that's giving any challenge is the merger between American and US Air, and the beauty of that is that it's worse. So United is going to be sitting pretty, and so the problem is that I know members of the United design team. They often send me emails complaining about their experiences, and they're just as frustrated as the customers because management is just not interested. And management's not interested because, frankly, the investment isn't worth it. For an airline like United to actually deliver great service, they would have to completely retrofit the way that they work. They would have to renegotiate contracts with their unions. They would have to change the procedures and policies that they've put in place. Most of the problems that United customers have, I've learned over the years of studying them, is communication issues within the organization. So they'd have to completely redo their communication infrastructure. All that investment would be huge, and they would rather spend it on a Dreamliner, which gives them market value, than just retrofitting their customer stuff. So the investment is just not there. The return is not there because there is no competitor that's really going to take their money away at this point. And so, at some point, someone's going to wake up and decide that there's a lot more money to be made if you deliver great customer service than if you don't, and that's at the point when everybody else starts to pay attention. We see that in some industries now, but the ones that are sort of older, more regulated industries, those are not there. But we're seeing it. Hotels are completely scared of Airbnb. The transportation industry is completely scared of Uber. And the reason that these organizations are scared is that the overall experiences from both of those businesses is radically better than the experience that that is currently delivered in the industry. And remember, Blockbuster was the leader when Netflix came out. And Netflix beat them based on experience. So, experience can win if the market lets it. The problem with the airline industry and some of these bigger industries, banking being another one, is that regulation actually prevents that from happening. And that's the problem there. So that's why. So just vote with your wallet. That's the way you do it. Question over here for Dimitri.
Thank you, Jared. A lot of great points. Just one clarification. I'm not sure I heard this correctly, but
I probably didn't say it correctly.
On Netflix, if you look at whether or not people go to the queue and reorder things or add things, that's a predictor of...
In the video disc days, that was their KPI.
Okay, and that makes sense because, if you become dissatisfied with the service for some reason, you're going to stop going into the queue. But it sounded as if you said what you need to do is make it easier to manipulate the queue.
No, but if you can optimize for queue manipulation within the activity, right? So for example, one of the designs they were playing with at the time when they had discs was they had the ability to watch movie trailers. And they came up with 5 different variations on how you could watch movie trailers. And the metric that they used to determine which of those variations was successful was which ones made it easier to take a movie and put it in the queue. Now, when they did the qualitative study, they watched people in the lab, they would actually ask them if that was something they intended to put in the queue. If they put it in by accident, then definitely it was not a good idea. But if it's a movie they liked and they got it in the queue, that was great. But if there were movies they liked and they didn't put it in the queue, that was a problem. So they looked at that behavior, and then when they did the quantitative studies by putting the variations out in the field, they looked for the same sort of traits. And then when they saw the winners and the losers, they brought them back into the lab and studied them some more to understand why people were putting things in the queue with one variation more than with the other. And they were comparing the two of them. But they start with that metric, queue manipulation. as sort of the business proxy, the KPI, that will help them understand whether in fact it's making customers happier or sadder with the service. So that's the basic idea. Question way back there. You got the mic? You have to hold the little button at the bottom. It's a usability test.
Thanks very much. The Gallup CE11 is interesting. I get more and more uncomfortable as you go down the set of questions. The Net Promoter Score is out there. It's a single question. It seems to be...
It's a loyalty question. It's the second question in the C11, is would you recommend this to the friend? Now, one of the things about Net Promoter is it's a 10-point scale. Notice that we use the 3-point scale in the CE11. More scale does not necessarily mean more things. ACSI uses a 100-point scale, right? Here's a little trick about statistics. When statisticians go for a longer scale, it's because there's less variation between the points. If they used a 5-point scale, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between companies. So they go to a 10-point scale so you can see the difference between companies. The reason they go to a 10-point scale is because there's not much difference between companies. Right? So the problem with Net Promoter is that the worst Net Promoters come in at about a 7.2 or something. Right? They're fairly low. I mean, they're fairly high. The best ones come in at about an 8.4. It's got a very small range that most companies fit in for most times. And companies are looking at, it's like, oh my gosh, our Net Promoter dropped from 7.9 to 7.8. What are we going to do about that? And the thing is that that's probably noise. When you have changes that small, you can't really react. The other problem with Net Promoter is there's nothing diagnostic about it. Here's the deal. I fly United all the time. I will continue to fly United for a long time. The reason I fly United is that out of Boston, it has the best options for all the places I need to go. So I fly United for most of my trips because of that. The other thing is that even when there are other options to go someplace on United, I still choose United. The reason being is that when you get above 75,000 miles, you become a platinum member. And as a platinum member, you get less screwed than when you're a gold member or a silver member. So it does not behoove me to be less than platinum. So if it's everything else is equal, I will choose that. If you ask me which airline to fly on, I would recommend you take United, because they have the best hubs and that platinum thing works. So focus all your miles on United. I hate United.
That's the place I want to go. I think my point about the Net Promoter Score is, I work in medicine with healthcare software for managing complex patients, and I've been in medicine long enough, and you probably have all had the forms too. Doctors like to ask you lots of questions. I think my question about the Net Promoter versus the CE11 was, do those really weird, freaky questions at the bottom make a difference? Because none of the companies seem to get any rating on that one. And,
companies do.
Which I know, but that seems to be pathological more than productive. That's the question. And I think that the question is just, were those questions validated to have any significant meaning? Because I don't think we all.
Oh yeah, no, they validated that. This is one of the things we like about that thing, is they actually validated for variation and engagement. It does, in fact. The reason we like the C11 is that it makes a huge difference. People will rank an organization that way. But the real thing about the C11 is the changes, right? The perception before and the perception after. You can actually take that measure multiple times, because it only takes, when you get practiced at it, it only takes a few times. So when we're designing experiences, when we do our e-commerce studies, we measure it at the time of recruitment. So before the person's come into the study, we ask them their score. Then at the time they show up, we ask them the score. Then at strategic points in the purchase process, we ask them their score, and then after fulfillment, we ask them their score. And we can actually see where the scores are shifting.
Great, and you're suggesting that every question is important, and that's very helpful.
It's what's called a Gutman scale, so it's a step function. And the companies, the companies at the later questions will only get those things if they score well on the earlier questions. So it helps you discriminate from one company to the next, and that's what makes it valuable. Okay. Oh yeah.
Just one other piece related to this, related to the CE11 is the history behind it, because the Gallup firm started with a study back from the 70s that they were doing over like 30 years of studies on what constitutes good managers and what makes people good at their jobs. And that has led to some of the, unfortunately, badly used performance management systems that are, used by companies. But if you look up Marcus Buckingham, the original author of that material, and there are several books about management and studies, you can follow the history through the Gallup's work, and that led to a lot of the questions you see here, you see reflected in those questions about what constitutes good management. So there's a big psychological basis of years of study behind that.
Yeah. No, they've done a fabulous job. There are other metrics too, but they're my favorite in terms of ease of implementation and use. Brian.
It's going to be the last one. Sorry.
Okay.
We're running out of time.
Okay.
Jared, I get your comment about United and regulation and not having an incentive, but I'm just wondering how you explain some of the pathologically bad user interfaces in companies that don't seem to be regulation driven. And I'm thinking primarily United is for you, for me it's these GPS systems where I'll sit here in Waltham and say, take me to 100 Main Street. And it says, 100 Main Street in Wichita? It's like, no, perhaps someplace close to here. How do they possibly come up with the choices of what is a best bet? I tried to get to La Jolla when I was in San Francisco and it said, Main Street, Tehran? I don't think there is a Main Street Tehran. I don't think you can drive there. You just got me on a watch list.
Right. I didn't know there was a Main Street in Tehran. I guess there probably should be, but I'm surprised it's called Main Street. Seems awfully American of them. There's an old rule of thumb, which is that it takes absolutely no skill to do something poorly. And so companies that do things poorly are doing them poorly because they're not applying any skills to doing them well. And there's a corollary to that, which is once you remove quality as a requirement, everything else becomes a lot less expensive. And so what happens is that companies cut costs. And in the process of cutting costs, they reduce quality. And once they start reducing quality, they see benefits to that, so they keep doing it more. And they come up with very cheap production. The fact is that really well-designed things are expensive. They are just expensive to make, they're expensive to build, and they're expensive to manage. And so organizations that are very good at this are good at it because they are making that investment. And they see the return on that investment. And it's interesting now that Apple is the most valuable company in the world by basically making that investment. In other markets, in the airline market, Virgin America is seeing success there, so is Southwest. In the entertainment business, organizations like Cirque du Soleil are now making more money than all of Broadway every night. So we're seeing places where investment is being made in quality and in design, and it's getting return on that investment. But in a lot of industries, that's not happening yet because no one's making the investment, and then some little company comes in, blows the socks off of everybody, and then everybody is scrambling around to do better. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for encouraging my